Thank you so much. I just want to echo the gratitude of everybody that came before me, to Philip Brookman for the beautiful exhibition and for the invitation to be here, to the National Gallery of Art for doing this symposium here, which I think is really significant now. And for others in the room, to be among this company of people speaking is such a privilege and an honor. And I won't name all my heroes in the room, but I will name Professor Rick Powell, who was my first and only art history professor. I took one class with him, so it kind of skewed my vision of what the canon of art history was. I thought everybody knew who Edmonia Lewis was, and Elizabeth Catlett, and Archibald Motley, and turns out not everybody did at that time when I studied with him, and a lot more people do because of his work. I didn't study art. I studied history and politics, and didn't think I was going to be an artist. I actually came to Washington and worked in politics after college for a short time, but like Devin, I couldn't stand working in an office, and was offered the opportunity to go out and photograph as part of a fellowship in, of all places, Ethiopia, about which I knew very little. I was sent there for a year to make a documentary project. So I knew little about photography, I knew little about Ethiopia, and I was there for a year to make a project. And that actually ended up becoming a 10-year sort of love affair with the country of Ethiopia, with the people, with working there. I lived there for, and made projects there for 10 years, and I still continue to work there today. One of the very first photographs I made was this one. This is called Beletu. What I realized about photography, even though I knew very little about it, is that there were power relationships bound up in the photographic process. And when I, as a photographer, as somebody with a camera, was photographing somebody else, it's a microcosm of all kinds of power relationships, about colonialism, about race, about gender, that are bound up in that relationship. And so to mitigate that sort of the problematics of a kind of hierarchy of power within the photographic process, I started thinking about collaboration as a form of work. And eventually my medium would become collaboration, and I would collaborate with other artists on projects, as well as with communities or people who didn't necessarily consider themselves artists. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of some projects that I worked on in that vein, and then talk mainly about a large project that I'm working on now with Hank Willis Thomas called Four Freedoms. But at the beginning, when I was figuring out what to photograph in Ethiopia, this was one of the first photographs I made. It was, like I said, it was titled Beletu. That is not the name of this woman, but it is the name that she chose. At the time, HIV/AIDS was highly stigmatized, and this woman was HIV positive. And so even though she was sort of not anonymous or untitled in the way that Robin Cost Lewis mentioned this morning, she did choose to be disguised in the image. And because the disease was so highly stigmatized, the only way I could make images of people with HIV at that moment, this is 20 years ago now in Ethiopia, was for them to have a hand in making the image. And so that negotiation between me and this woman and about 35 other people who allowed me to photograph them over the course of 5 years of photographing, my first 5 years of photographing in Ethiopia, demanded that the subject of the photograph had a hand in the making of it. And so collaboration became a necessity for me in order to make images. And the result was that I started thinking about how collaboration itself could be a medium. Like Devin is doing now, I started using these Polaroid cameras. I had studied briefly with Wendy Ewald, and she later became a mentor for me, somebody who kind of pioneered a way of working in participatory photography to shift ideas of authorship, who has the camera and who doesn't. And so what I was doing then was working in this one community. I ended up working in this one neighborhood in Ethiopia for a course of 10 years, teaching photography to a small group of people, and we made photographs about that neighborhood. and about life in that neighborhood, and health and education and disease and poverty, as described by people who were encountering these things within their neighborhood. And the photographs were different than the kinds of photographs I had seen made by other people that maybe looked like me, who had come to Ethiopia to make photographs for photojournalistic reasons or as documentary projects. The photographs became much more intimate. This is a photograph by Tenanesh Kifyalo entitled "If I Had a Home." This is somebody, she was also born with HIV and died at age 13, but when she was 11 and 12, we worked together, and she made a series of photographs that were sort of intimate visions of her own life, basically in her one-room home. These photographs were then exhibited around the community, and for the first 8 years of the project, only exhibited within Ethiopia, traveling around the neighborhood, traveling around the country, and much later they would be made into a book where we were trying to expand the number of people that understood what life in this one neighborhood was like. People from the community designed and traveled around with this exhibition and sort of used it as an educational tool around the country. And so this notion of collaboration, I'm not going to go too deeply into any of these projects, but I just wanted to mention that this was something, thinking about how other people could insert their voices into the photographic process, other than the photographer, was a way for me to understand how to deal with the history of documentary photography. This is a project that Wendy and I did with some photographs that she made in 1969 up in Labrador, Canada, where we brought them back to the Indigenous Reserve where she made them, and worked with people to update the sort of public image of the community from that previous time. I also worked in post-conflict Lebanon in 2006 and 2007, working with people to create these sort of anti-monuments. The town was reduced to rubble, and we were making these photographs and placing them in the landscape in a very ephemeral sort of way, where they just existed in that place for as long as they existed. But it was a way to kind of repopulate the rubble of war with people's individual memories. So a lot of these projects ended up taking me to different communities around the world and working for intensely and deeply in these places, not that many places, like 3 or 4 places over the course of 20 years. And so when I started working on this project, For Freedoms, which I started with Hank in 2015, we had a very different kind of mandate. We were thinking not about how can we go deep in one place, but how can we use the power of art as a binding force to make public conversation more robust. We saw art as inherently political. It was a practice of politics. And so we wanted to expand the scale of how art could affect public discourse and affect public policy. So the first thing we did was to make a super PAC, and I didn't know what a super PAC did at the time, but we later found out that super PACs are basically political advertising firms. And we put up a small series of billboards, about 10 billboards across the country in the lead up to the 2016 election. This was one of them that we put up in Pearl, Mississippi. And at first, nobody really noticed it, and then the election happened, and then 2 weeks after the election, every media outlet picked it up. And what I love about the way CNN reported on this is that they reported Mississippi residents unsure of controversial billboards' intent. I mean, CNN is not used to reporting on uncertainties. They're, screaming graphics and, like loud headlines. This was reporting on the possibility of nuance and uncertainty. And we were trying to sow that by inserting these artist messages out into the landscape. So we expanded that. And we thought that, we asked the question, what would it look like if we did that across the country? And not only put these signs out across the country, but also create partnerships with arts institutions across the country to create dialogue about what these signs mean in the landscape. So we designed a series of town hall meetings and exhibitions in 2018, last year, in what we called the 50-state initiative. The 50-state initiative ended up having arts institutions and partners. We had 250 institutional partners in all 50 states, as well as in the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We had millions of views of the billboards and on social media. There were over 100 exhibitions, 120 town hall meetings held by artists and institutions. There were about 800 artists that were involved in this large-scale national effort. Some of these billboards that went up, they confused people. This was a billboard in Lansing, Michigan by the artist Jamila El-Sahili, and the word means human being in Arabic. But when people saw this, the billboard company got all kinds of phone calls asking, what on earth, what's happening here? Is this ISIS? Come to find out that the message was sort of revealing some of the biases that people had. This image by Sean Leonardo went up in Florida and created another kind of conversation, which was, this says Trayvon Martin would have been 23 years old, could have voted. People started saying, well, what does it matter whether he could have voted? He was a human being, and that conversation started taking place. And the Trayvon Martin Foundation, created by his family, jumped into the conversation and said, this is something that we want to create a conversation about getting people, engaged in the political process. So, these public conversations ended up sort of taking their own course in ways that we could no longer control. So we ended up sort of decentralizing a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the arts institutions that we partnered with, we had very little interplay with, but rather people were doing different things in different parts of the country that connected to each other, and we just became the connective tissue toward these different nodes. We started imagining a creative infrastructure in the United States that might shift the way in which public discourse happens. This is a flag by Dred Scott that was placed outside a gallery in Chelsea as part of one of our exhibitions. That ended up being reported on and then collected in different institutions. Another part of and I'll just finish up with this, another big part of the campaign was that we were thinking also of the 1940s and the way in which art was sort of an instrument of politics at that time and used as propaganda, right? We saw that this morning, thinking about the FSA and how that sort of transformed in the Office of War Information, and even how Gordon Parks was working with Standard Oil. There was kind of a mode of image making that was related to the creation of propaganda. In 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke the four freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, in a State of the Union speech intended to encourage the United States to enter the war, to create support for entering World War II. 2 years later, Norman Rockwell painted these four freedoms, which became iconic images of what it meant to be American, but it was mainly just white people, which may have reflected Rockwell's or the Times vision of what it meant to be American. There was one African-American woman in the top left of the freedom of worship picture. Last year, we made new updated images of the Four Freedoms pictures to point to the fact that these iconic images of what it meant to be American were, in fact, another kind of propaganda. They were turned into war bonds posters to raise money for the war at that time, but they were also promoting a vision of what it meant to be American and of citizenship that was clearly outdated and not inclusive at the time, and certainly not now. So these images ended up being, we made not only 4 images, we made 80 images with different characters, different people. In fact, Devin's the star of one of these photographs, one of the freedom of speech photographs. And different activists, artists, and cultural workers sort of participated in the creation of these images and in their distribution through billboards, on the cover of Time magazine, and in different places around the country. And we were really just trying to point to something, that Gordon Parks practiced, which was shifting who was in the picture and shifting how that changed the way in which we perceive these iconic images. And I'll just end on this. We have an exhibition up that opened last night. I came down very late after the opening last night at the International Center of Photography in New York. That's kind of a recap of our 50-state initiative. And in it is a large billboard with an image by Gordon Parks, granted to us by the Gordon Parks Foundation. And the title of the exhibition is Where Do We Go From Here? Which is also the title of Martin Luther King's last speech and book. And that is where we are thinking now ahead to 2020. What do we do with this national network of artists and creative people that we've created moving forward? How do we further engage the creative community and think about creativity as an essential American value? So thank you very much.